Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video called How to Spiral Cone Wedge Clay. So wedging is a very important part of the clay preparation process. It does three things. First, it works out air bubbles. Sometimes clay kind of has some kind of like air, significant kind of little air pockets in it, and those can cause kind of explosions in the kiln firing process when the kiln reaches the boiling point, and there's sometimes steam creates builds within these pockets and forces its way out in explosive ways. So one thing that's important, it gets the air out. Two, it aligns clay particles, so it makes your clay walls kind of architecturally much stronger and reduces arbitrary cracks. And the last thing, it kind of homogenizes the clay. It makes it all the same consistency, so you don't have one part of your clay that's firmer than another part. It's all the same kind of degree of softness when you're working with it. So those three things are accomplished by this one kind of almost kneading process. And I'm doing this on the floor today because many of you don't have wedging tables, which usually are made of plaster, thick bats of plaster. So if you don't have that type of equipment at home, you just need to have a board. And I know many of you have a board that you use to work on. A piece of this cotton duck canvas, which I've just kind of wrapped around the edges so that it's not going to move around. I want it to stay still when I'm doing this kind of kneading process. And so I have it wrapped around at the edges, and I'm even kneeling on the canvas at the very front of the board. So I'm starting off by wedging about a 5-pound block of clay. I find that if you try to practice with too little, your hands get in the way. If you try to practice with too much clay, it's just too physical, and you can work up to that. But if you're going to just start learning how to wedge, I would suggest about 4 or 5 pounds as a starting point. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sit the clay down kind of on the center of our wedging surface, and we're going to extend our arms out, right, so that they're right on top of it. Now this can be physical, so like any physical activity, it's a good idea to stretch a little first, and these kind of muscles within your forearms are what you really utilize. So and we don't use those a whole lot. So if you just kind of sit your arm down and kind of like extend your arms straight up, you'll feel the muscles kind of pull. Or you can just extend your arm out like that and kind of pull back on your fingers, and you'll feel those muscles kind of stretch a little bit. So it's a little pre-stretch exercise before you start to wedge. Okay, now extend those arms so that your hands are basically just on top of that mound of clay, kind of right at the top. Your thumbs almost kind of like butt against each other, right? And we're going to kind of push in a forward direction. Right on, kind of on the middle of the clay. So you'll see that the clay's plastic, so it's just going to move. So I'm going to kind of do that first compression where I push forward, and it kind of creases the clay kind of just like that with the kind of base of your palms of your hands, right? So that compression happens. Then as you pull the clay back towards yourself, you're going to turn it about a 15-degree turn. And that's really slight, but it's important that you give it that turn. And then you put your hands back to that same top point. And again, another compression, and then a pull back and a 15-degree turn. And you keep on doing that back and forth, where you're just kind of pushing, pulling back with that turn, pushing, pulling back with that turn, pushing, pulling back with that turn. And you're basically kind of creating these slight compressions, and you'll see them here in a minute. I'll hold this clay up, and you'll see kind of how each one of those little wrinkles is kind of a different compression. Each one of those was a 15-degree turn. And you'll notice that there's a spiraling that's occurring here with the majority of the clay. And you'll see it kind of spiraling further and further towards the center point. And that's kind of the side of the piece of clay. So continue to push, compress, pull back 15 degrees with a turn. And again, don't try to do too much at once. Right? If you're getting tired, maybe you're kind of working with your arms too much. I use my body, I rock it back and forth from the shoulders, so that kind of takes all the force. And as long as I'm, doing the right thing with my hands as far as having them in the right spot for the compression and pulling back and turning that 15-degree turn each time, then it doesn't tire me out, right? I shouldn't get winded, right? I shouldn't feel pain, right? It should be kind of a pretty relaxed rhythm that you kind of create. And if you're wondering, did I wedge it enough? You can kind of take a wire tool and you can kind of cut through it at any point and look at the center. And oh, that's nice. You don't see any kind of air pockets, any nooks and crannies. It looks all so similar and consistent, right? And that's where you're kind of looking for with well wedged kind of clay. And when you're putting your clay back together after cutting it with like a wire tool, make sure you go flat side to flat side so you don't trap air between the pieces like you would if you, slap the irregular outsides just like that. And then go back to the wedging process. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this spiral cone wedging process, and practice it just a little bit. Don't practice it for too long because your clay will start to dry out. Practice it for 5 and 10 minutes every time you kind of start working with clay. And this is something you'll always do with all the clay, whether you throw it on the potter's wheel, whether you roll out slabs with it next, whether you turn it into kind of coils and coil build. You'll always be kind of going through this kind of wedging process prior to building something, making something, or throwing something in pottery and in clay. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.